Coming up, a new era in U.S.-Iran relations.
Nothing has happened yet, but I must say this is probably the most positive moment I have seen in that whole period of time since the Iranian Revolution.
Columbia University's Gary Sick discusses new Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and his effect on Obama, America, and the Middle East. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Dr. Sick served on the National Security Council under three presidents, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. He was the principal White House advisor for Persian Gulf affairs from 1976 to 81. So by definition, that, of course, was a period that saw the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis. He's now adjunct professor of international affairs and senior research scholar at Columbia University. Gary, welcome back to the Carnegie Council.
This is a real pleasure. Thank you very much, David.
I should say that literally before we came down, Gary and I watched the streaming of President Rouhani's speech at the United Nations. So the good news is we heard President Rouhani's speech. The bad news is we've torn up the script and rewrote it, just for your benefit. But Gary, obviously, as this day dawned, we thought we might be on the cusp of something, a defining or redefining moment in U.S.-Western Iranian relations. We have a new Iranian president here in town at the General Assembly. There's been an exchange of letters between the two presidents. That, of course, has happened before, one gathers, but not always with great result. There's been the release of at least a handful of political prisoners in Iran, the appointment of a Western-educated foreign minister. So a lot was going on. And now, of course, we've heard Presidents Obama and Rouhani speak. What's your immediate reaction?
You have to start from the point, so far it's just talk. I mean, we really have not seen anything happen yet. But in my experience, and I've been living this whole business of U.S.-Iran relations ever since 1977, actually, I have never in that long period of time seen a positive action, a set of positive rhetorics from both sides. Basically, what usually happens is that one side or the other feels that it can make an offer, it can say something important, it can suggest something, or it can say, I'm ready. And typically the other side isn't. So for me to see Rouhani elected in a surprise election that was really the Iranian people voting against the system. When they voted for him, he was making it very clear he intended to take a very different view. And so he has done that. And within a month now, we have President Obama standing up before the world and laying out the outlines of a possible settlement between the two sides.
Iran's genuine commitment to go down a different path will be good for the region and the world.
As I say, nothing has happened yet, but I must say this is probably the most positive moment I have seen in that whole period of time since the Iranian Revolution.
I mean, obviously, of the various things that have been said about Rouhani, even before he landed on these shores, that he was out to build trust, serious and substantial talks were likely to happen. On the other hand, he's been described as the consummate regime insider, and the phrase most often used was charm offensive, which is just a wee bit derogatory, if not. No. Just give us a couple of takeaways from what he said this afternoon.
Well, his speech this afternoon, in one respect, was sort of typical Iranian. He covered all the waterfront. He hit all the bases. He didn't mention the word Israel, which actually, it's really very clear. I mean, Mr. Netanyahu was not mentioned. Israel was not mentioned. And I'm sure that his predecessor was easier to deal with for Israel than this guy is. Because Ahmadinejad, I was in a meeting with an American Jewish group not too long, well, it was about a year ago, 2 years ago. And I was giving a talk about what Iran's relations with the West are and so forth. And a guy stood up there who was a Jewish leader in some part of the United States. And he said, before I ask my question, he said, I do have to make a comment. And he said, I sometimes think that Ahmadinejad is a Mossad agent, that he was actually working for Israel, because he said, never in our entire history have we had anybody who has increased our fundraising, and that he said, we just mention his name and people open up their checkbooks. And so that's not a joke, actually, you know, I mean, it actually works that way. And let me, to look at what Rouhani said, first of all, he wants to identify himself as the sort of anti-Ahmadinejad. He is the guy who represents the polar opposite. And he wants people to think of Iran as a cultured, sensible state, a nation that can actually participate actively and constructively in international affairs. That was not Ahmadinejad's approach. And so he wants to portray Iran that way, which is the way, in fact, a lot of Iranians see their country. And so to that end, what he did was hit on all of the key points that Iran usually hits on, but his theme was violence. And he said that what the world should do, what the UN should do, is to focus on violence in the Middle East. And he then identified a number of examples of what violence looks like. Not to anybody's surprise, he thought that the use of sanctions, which affect ordinary people far beyond the leadership, is a form of violence. And that the use of that, the threat of the use of military force, is violence. The treatment of the Palestinians, from his point of view, was violence, the way they are dealt with and so forth. He actually proposed at the end of his speech, he said, instead of creating coalitions for war in the Middle East, we ought to create coalitions in favor of nonviolence. And whether this will take off or anything will come of it, I don't know, but it cast a sort of, it gave a structure to his remarks. And I think that is what he wanted to do. He also then hit some very specific points about what they're prepared to do. He, in the clearest, most unequivocal possible way, said, we have no interest in building nuclear weapons. We never will under any circumstances, and that anybody who is using that as a means of sort of blowing up the Iranian threat is in fact just wanting to attack us. There's no justification for that. And I must say in passing that Iran started its nuclear program. They took a decision in the mid-1980s that they were going to build a nuclear program. The Shah had done some earlier. They had renounced it. Then they came back to it. And most countries that build a nuclear weapon, Israel, South Africa, India, Pakistan, those countries, typically from the time they take a decision until they have a device in hand, even a country as poor as Pakistan, takes about 10 years at the maximum. It can be shorter than that. Iran took its decision to build a nuclear program in 1985. And according to our best intelligence, they have not taken a decision to build a nuclear weapon yet. And still, we are treating them as if they're an imminent threat to us. There's something, and so this is basically what he was focusing on, is that there was a disconnect here between what they're doing actually and what they want. And it's clear that he has some things in mind. The newest thing that happened, quite beyond Rouhani's speech, and I think Obama's speech is very important also, is that on Thursday, the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, we're going to sit down and have a strategy session about Iran. What do we say to Iran when we get together in our next meeting? And wonder of wonders, yesterday, Zarif, the new foreign minister, who is a friend of many people in New York and Washington, met with Cathy Ashton, who is the EU representative to the talks. And at the end of the meeting, she announced that Iran was joining the meeting. It'll be the very first time that the foreign minister of Iran has sat down with the foreign ministers of all of those states, and certainly the first time that any Iranian foreign minister has sat down with the Secretary of State of the United States, who will be at the table.
And by the way, you mentioned the President Obama handing over to Kerry the negotiation. I believe I read also that Rouhani has also transferred authority for negotiations on the nuclear question
To his foreign
his
ministry.
foreign ministry, away from the national
That is
security.
correct.
Yeah.
So actually, Rouhani himself was the negotiator for Iran on the nuclear issue in the past. Nobody in Iran knows the nuclear file better than he does. He was the personal representative of the Supreme Leader on the National Security Council staff for 25 years. And he was the personal representative who negotiated with the Europeans back in 2003 to 2005 when they were on the cusp of a deal, and the United States government stepped in and said, no way, we're having nothing to do with any kind of a deal, and it fell through, which then got him tagged, Rouhani got tagged as basically as an appeaser, basically a guy who was ready to give away the store, and the other side kicked him out, and that you can't trust these Americans, look what they did to us, and that you were naive to believe that you would in fact get them to go along with you. That's where he's coming from. And so this guy's going to be wary. He's going to watch out because he does believe in his heart of hearts that the Americans are not to be trusted, and we believe the same thing with regard to him. So that makes for an interesting combination. But Zarif was the UN ambassador here in New York for 5 years. And in the course of that time, all of us who work on Iran, and I say literally all of us, I mean basically the think tank people, the people in Washington, the people here who are do Iran work, specialize in that, all of us have met him, have had dinner with him, we've been on panels with him, we've talked to him privately, we all know him very well. And that includes people like Joe Biden, who basically met him. A number of key people in the Congress have sat down at his dinner table as well. He knows American politics very well. His English is flawless, absolutely impeccable. And he's the guy now in charge of the game. So that's where we were beginning from. So that is hopeful.
The most recent Foreign Affairs, there's an article I'm sure you've read by Akbar Ganji, the Iranian journalist and dissident. It's called "Who is Khamenei, the Mind of Iran's Supreme Leader?" A pretty daunting topic, I'd have thought. But given the writer's background, it's a pretty balanced piece, it seemed to me. But he reminds us of two things that seem to be self-evident, but also important. One is Khamenei is Iran's head of state, commander-in-chief and top ideologue. His views are what will ultimately shape Iranian policy. Second, while a cultured individual who seems to relish contact with Western scholars, his views have hardened with a growing conviction that what the U.S. and the West seeks is regime change in Iran. And yet Khamenei came out before, and a few days ago, with this intriguing phrase, heroic flexibility. What is heroic flexibility and who is Khamenei? And you've got 3 minutes.
Yeah. The Iranians are very good at phrases like this. In the days of Mossadegh, they used the idea of negative equilibrium. In this case, it's actually a wrestling term, and the Iranians love wrestling.
They've just won the world championships, of course.
This is their national sport, but it basically is a way of dealing with your opponent, so that you give a little bit in order to get a little bit, and to overcome your opponent. So the concept is heroic in the sense that you win in the end, but the flexibility is that you know when to back off, when to change, when to shift your ground, and so forth, and that you are flexible in your ability to deal with reality. So it's not a bad thing. There's just add one small word here. There's been a lot written about Khamenei, and I'm in a minority, but I am one of those who believes that he's not as supreme as he's made out to be. This whole business about the supreme leader, he wants everybody to believe that. And in some respects, the best way to put it, I think, is that Khamenei has a veto. That if basically he wants to stop something that is coming along, he does have the power to step in and do that. He doesn't do it very often. And the other thing that happens, he is a coalition builder. He actually is quite insecure in his position. He got that job almost by default. And he is, for instance, it was supposed to be, originally, it was designed for Khamenei, his predecessor, the founder of the revolution, who was a grand scholar, a truly grand Ayatollah, whose qualifications on religious thought were doubted by nobody. Actually, Khamenei took the job. When he took it, he had not even done what you would call his thesis for becoming an Ayatollah. He was not an Ayatollah, and they just promoted him overnight. So the word Ayatollah attached to him is a construct. It's been invented. And so he has never had the full support of the clergy in Iran, certainly not the clergy in the Shia center in Najaf in Iraq. They deny the whole concept of religious governance. And he is constantly trying to balance people out. In the last few years, he has become very dependent on the Revolutionary Guard. That is, he needed them to support him. And in that sense, I have felt he was actually less supreme, if you like, than the Revolutionary Guard. My point is not that he's powerless or that he isn't influential, just that his power is not the kind of thing that you think of a Stalin or a Saddam Hussein. I mean, it's a very different kind of power, and it's the power to build coalitions, not to come in and say to everybody, this is the way it's going to be, and everybody jumps. It doesn't work that way in Iran.
Rouhani is one of the, if you allow me to say it, I don't want to agree with it, puppets of Khamenei. He's not going to make the decisions. Accordingly, it seems to me, and I'd like your reaction to it because it's the opposite of what Obama is doing, and it seems to me that our policy is so naive that we should say, no, we're not going to speak to you. We've been speaking to you. We have numerous resolutions put out by the UN. Act out what we've asked for already. Thank you.
This is an extremely common position, and in the media, it's probably the majority position. There's a great deal of support for that. I think that it's wrong in almost every aspect in terms of where we are in terms of reality. We had a case where Iran, right after 9/11, the United States went into Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban. Iran was happy to get rid of the Taliban. It was their worst enemy to the east. So, and Iran, unlike us, had actually been cultivating the opposition in Afghanistan for a long time. So they came to us and offered their assistance and said, okay, we'll help you in your takeover of Afghanistan, and they did. They brought the Northern Alliance into the operation, and which was critical in making it happen. And then they went to Bonn, and it was actually Mr. Zarif, the present foreign minister, who was their representative dealing with Zalmay Khalilzad and his friends in the operation in Afghanistan. They succeeded. The Bonn conference succeeded largely, and the Americans who were there give credit to Iran for doing that. And then a month later, after that was over, George Bush went on public television with his State of the Union address and described Iran as a member of the axis of evil. And the whole, to say that the Iranians were stunned by this is really an understatement. They've never really recovered from that effect in terms of what do you expect us to do? Are we supposed to just completely surrender, lie down, and do anything you tell us to do, and then maybe you will take us seriously? You know, and that aspect of it, it seems to me, never makes it into the American media. The reality is that, and I insist on this, that Khamenei is a super pragmatist, and he knows, for instance, if there is momentum going for some kind of a settlement between the United States and Iran, that's going to be very popular in Iran and be very popular with the very constituencies that he relies on. And I'll bet you that he will not stand up and oppose it on grounds, say, theological grounds or something of the sort. Instead, I think he'll take it very seriously. And I think it's a mistake for us to assume that he won't.
Would this new moderation in tone be happening at all if economic sanctions were not apparently as effective as they apparently have been, to everyone's surprise?
Actually, the sanctions are America's new weapon of mass destruction. I mean, it really is, that's not an exaggeration. We have now mastered the manipulation of the economic system to the point where even if Iran sells its oil, it can't get paid for it. They won't clear through international banks. But at the same time that we're affecting their oil, we're also affecting the small businessman in Tehran and the people. Medicines are completely exempted from the sanctions, and yet they have to be paid for through the banks. And the banks refuse to do it, simply on the grounds that they might make a mistake and we would put sanctions on them, and that they can't afford to take a chance. So basically, the access to medicines is cut off, access to international markets is cut off, and this affects everybody. But I remind you that in 2003, Iran offered an agreement with us that was really quite good. They stopped for 2 years, they quit all of their enrichment and said, we're ready to do a deal with you guys. And they were prepared. And it was Rouhani who was the negotiator, who negotiated that. That was before sanctions. So yes, sanctions offer an incentive right now. There's no question about it. And Rouhani this afternoon in his speech specifically identified sanctions as a form of violence, which, I can see from his perspective would be justified. So it is a factor, but I think the point is that it goes beyond just sanctions. It isn't just sanctions. So the people who say, gee, sanctions did all of this, so let's put on more sanctions, and obviously that'll take care of it. Beware of what you're hearing, because in reality, the people who argue that all we need is more pressure, more sanctions, more threats of military action, and so forth, are really people who don't really want a negotiated settlement with Iran. What they really want, and they don't say so publicly, is regime change. They want to overthrow the regime in Iran and replace it with another one. I would like that. I have no problem with the idea of regime change. But in the meantime, I would rather have a workable, verifiable, transparent agreement with Iran about its nuclear activities than an attempt, which I think is ill-founded, to think that we can overthrow their regime by putting sanctions on and threatening them with military force and assassinating scientists and doing the various other things that go on.
Suppose we are fortunate enough to see some good diplomatic development, a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. It would take some time. What would be the effect on that happy progress of A, punitive bombing by us in Syria, or B, a military defeat or impending defeat of Assad by these various rebels?
I see Syria as a potential opportunity for the Obama administration with regard to Iran and this set of circumstances that we now have. On the Iranian thing, the one thing that Rouhani spoke with passion about in his speech was their hatred for chemical weapons. And he was equivocal about the use of chemical weapons by Assad. This is a sort of diplomatic fiction that Iran and the Russians have maintained, and it lets them deal with Assad in a special way. So if they're going to be effective with him, they can't come in and say, you used chemical weapons. So they pretend that it was the opposition. Everybody knows better, but it's a diplomatic fiction, and it can be useful. So, but Iran, he said clearly he wants to see, he fully supports Assad's recognition of Assad's willingness to do away with his chemical weapons. So Iran is on our side with regard to the chemical weapons and getting rid of them, and will, in fact, cooperate with us to see that that happens. The second thing is that Iran has, for actually a couple of years, been promoting the idea that what we should have, instead of a civil war, a collapse of Assad and the replacement by wild-eyed Sunni rebels who might actually end up being worse than Assad, and very likely would be worse than Assad. They're saying that's not a good answer to the question. And they've made it very clear that they will support a negotiated settlement that protects everybody involved and doesn't turn the system over to a bunch of real crazies. That's our position too. So in that sense, if we're smart enough and adept enough, we have the makings here of actually using that to help split them away from Assad. They've said that they're not committed to Assad personally. They want to see a change, but they want to see it in a smoother, peaceful way rather than a collapse. So there's something to work with. And Obama, in his speech, actually recognized that fact when he said all states should be invited to participate in the Geneva II operation to find a political solution. All states includes Iran. And that's the first time ever that the United States has suggested that we might, in fact, permit Iran to sit down at an international conference.
What you've given us today has been as rich as it has been timely, and it was also very kind of President Rouhani to come and speak.
It was.
And to start speaking just
I thought it was your timing.
I can't thank him directly, but I can thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.